In today's episode, we'll break down two important stories. First, we'll talk about the coordination puzzle staring at India's EV story, and then we'll talk about the second coming of Micromax. Welcome back to the Daily Brief by Zerodha, where we cut through the noise to help you understand what's actually happening in the most important stories from business and markets. I'm your host Akshara, and today is Thursday, 9th July. Coming to the first story. So, a few weeks ago on our Subtext podcast, we sat down with Zora Khan, the founder of IPEC, a Bangalore based company that designs and manufactures EV chargers for India's leading 2 and 3 wheeler makers. Now, everyone knows about India's subsidy architecture, PM e-drive, state-level incentives, the GST differential versus petrol cars. But one of the key points of discussion that stuck with us well after that chat had little to do with it. It was that India's EV transition isn't just about getting our manufacturing policy right. For instance, here's what she said about India's grid.
But I think what India has is a distribution problem, right? And that's where the discoms and a lot of these players do come into the picture. But this distribution layer, which is mainly the 11 kV and the 415 volt lines, right? That's what actually connects the grid to, let's say, your neighborhood. Right now, a lot of these lines are overloaded. For example, transformers, which are serving these residential areas, were probably installed for requirements for maybe 10 years ago or a long time ago, right? So they are overloaded. They need to be upgraded. Even, for example, in the air conditioning loads that are coming into effect right now will be causing a strain on the grid, let alone, let's say, EV charging coming into the picture, right? And
so when we dug deeper, we realized that electricity itself is just one part of the EV story. Think about it. For one, charging stations need a lot of land, so land acquisition becomes a factor. Each state is in control of its own transport, but they'll have to coordinate when it comes to charging infrastructure. And India needs all of this to happen at roughly the same pace because the vehicles are already here. India sold nearly 25 lakh EVs in FY26, but every one of those vehicles has to plug into a grid, at a station, on a piece of land, and the policies governing those three things were never designed to talk to each other. This story is about those frictions that exist between some of the crucial parts of India's EV policy that don't have much to do with EVs, but couldn't be more important to our EV ambitions. Let's first examine the state of electric freight. See, India's EV push has overwhelmingly focused on passenger two-wheelers and three-wheelers, and understandably so, given that they make up the vast majority of vehicles on Indian roads. But freight is just as important. Medium and heavy-duty trucks make up just 2% of India's vehicle fleet, but they contribute around 40% of all road transport emissions. So if we want the EV transition to matter to reducing emissions, electrifying freight has to be a priority. Yet, it's still a policy afterthought. Of the nearly 1.8 lakh public charging stations India has, only about 9,000 of them can charge a heavy-duty truck. But what makes freight a unique problem is that, unlike passenger vehicles that are mostly used within a city, a long-haul truck crosses multiple state borders in each trip. Its success depends fundamentally on coordination between states, but each additional crossing of a state border is emblematic of how difficult this is. Let's start with the money. Now, under India's constitution, transport is a state subject. So that means EV incentives like purchase subsidies, registration fee waivers, motor vehicle tax exemptions are set state by state. For instance, Maharashtra's 2025 EV policy offers purchase subsidies of up to Rs 20 lakh per electric truck for the first 1,000 heavy-duty goods carriers. Meanwhile, Madhya Pradesh offers 100% motor vehicle tax and registration exemptions. But a poorer state will simply not have the same kind of freedom. Very few states have incentives for heavy-duty, zero-emission trucks. And fleet operators in these states will face little reprieve compared to Maharashtra or Madhya Pradesh. Moreover, the vast majority of India's trucking sector is made up of small operators. About 75% own fewer than 5 trucks, and around 70% run on demand without formal long-term contracts. And these are cash dependent businesses with paper thin margins. On top of this, there's the charging infrastructure itself. So, long haul trucks can't use the slow or moderate chargers that work for passenger cars. They need high power DC chargers to avoid transit delays. But upgrading a single highway site to support 500 kilowatt of charging capacity can cost a few crores in capex and grid infrastructure upgrades alone. As far as public chargers are concerned, only states with healthier finances can afford this at scale. But beyond that, what also matters is the capacity of the state discom to approve new charging points to be integrated into the grid. Each new charging point could stress India's grid further unless the discom upgrades the distribution network accordingly. But that requires capital, which, as we've covered before, India's discoms are notorious for burning, having accumulated losses worth rupees 6.9 crore. What's more, there's significant variation within discoms, with certain states performing far better than others. So, if on a popular long highway, a single state discom hasn't planned for surge loads, the truck will pass through a charging desert. Now, India is officially a power surplus country. The amount of electricity we generate is more than enough to meet current demand. So, naturally, that means the failure isn't in generation, but in transmission. In our subtext episode, Zora highlighted that, in particular, the fault lies in the last mile of distribution, the 11 kilovolt lines and neighborhood distribution transformers that connect the grid to your building. Now, most of these transformers, typically rated between 100 to 250 kVA and serving 20 to 30 flats, were engineered for the electrical loads of a decade ago. And people come home in the evening, turn on the air conditioning, the lights, and the television. This summer, we've already seen that these transformers are unable to handle the crippling load of all these appliances, with transformer blasts becoming common in cities like Delhi and Chennai. Now add EVs to the picture. EV chargers use high frequency switching to convert the grid's AC power into DC for the vehicle battery. And this rapid switching of high amounts of power distorts the grid's smooth electrical waveform, injecting what engineers call harmonic currents into the system. Now, harmonics are also generated by smartphones and TVs, which run on DC power. But the magnitude of the same from EV charging is far bigger, generating excessive heat that can seriously damage the transformer. As per Terry, uncontrolled EV charging can spike instances of transformer overload by 5 to 22%. In the current state, if charged at night, EVs would shorten the lifespan of our transformers significantly. Now, solar power could help in theory, but the timing is often backwards. After all, vehicles are on the road when the sun is out and plugged in when it sets. Without battery energy storage systems or BESS, EV charging simply piles into an overloaded grid that will revert back to coal to meet rising demand. And for now, India's BESS adoption is still slow. Now, a transformer's primary job is to change the voltage of a stream of power so it doesn't directly affect how much power a home can consume. But each home also has a cap on how much power they can actually use. So most Indian homes run on a single phase connection capped at about 5 kilowatt of sanctioned load. A slow home charger for a two-wheeler draws about 3.3 kilowatt, while a four-wheeler requires somewhere between 3.3 to 7.4 kilowatt. These are manageable on their own. But if a household has multiple EVs, the load instantly exceeds the home's entire electrical capacity. So the natural solution is for the household to upgrade to a three-phase connection. But that requires a formal application to the local discom, a physical inspection of the neighborhood feeder line, and an out-of-pocket cost of rupees 10,000 to 30,000. The cost of it is significant bureaucracy and a sizable pinch in the pocket. And the grid level risk is even larger. India's electrical grid distributes power across three physical lines, phases A, B, and C, and the load across them needs to stay roughly balanced. So single phase chargers draw power from only one line. So if a residential complex plugs in multiple chargers without distributing them evenly across all three phases, the grid suffers severe voltage and current imbalances. That kind of asymmetry forces heavy currents through the neutral wire, rapidly overheating local distribution equipment and accelerating transformer failure. Now, even if the grid were perfectly ready, there's a simpler problem. Where do you physically build the charging station? The answer seems obvious. Dense residential clusters, office complexes, tech parks, airports, wherever there's lots of parking. But those are expensive pieces of land that make the economics of operating a charging hub. For charging point operators or CPOs, land rent combined with electricity tariffs can make up over 60% of a station's total operating expenses. So, what's an alternative? One natural workaround is co locating chargers at existing petrol pumps. They already sit on main roads, they already have customer traffic, and the land is already cleared for vehicle use. But bringing high voltage, high current electrical infrastructure right next to underground fuel storage tanks is strictly governed by Indian law. And the safety clearances required are exacting and for good reason, but they add significant time and cost to what should be a straightforward site decision. And since prime land is so hard to get, operators often settle for suboptimal solutions like curbs with no footfall, residential side streets where nobody will use a public charger, and sites on weak feeder lines that can't support the load. So, this helps explain the paradox of Indian EV charging. There are stations, but they're often not where people need them, and when they are, they sometimes can't deliver reliable power. This may also partly explain why most public chargers in India suffer from very low utilization rates of around 5%. However, contributing to this low utilization rate is a chicken or egg problem that has plagued EV adoption. People don't buy EVs without charging infrastructure, and operators don't build charging points without enough EVs being sold. High fixed rents and near empty stations make a terrible business model, which is also why financing for new stations is often hard to come by. Even if the operator eyes a piece of land that could guarantee the economics, they face a clearance gauntlet. So, to set up a single charging station, a CPO needs DISCOM load sanctions, chief electrical inspector safety clearances, local municipal zoning permissions, and no objection certificates from the fire department. Each of these comes from a different government body with its own process and timeline. There's no unified single window portal in most states, and the result is that charging stations take far longer to set up than the demand side policy assumes they will. At least in theory, solutions to most of these problems do exist. For instance, in freight, the answer isn't to wait for all 28 states to align, but to think in terms of corridors. For instance, the Delhi Jaipur corridor is being used by the government as a pilot for zero emission trucking. So, states along these corridors can jointly coordinate grid upgrades and enforce time bound clearances without waiting for a nationwide consensus. Now, for the grid, smart meters and dynamic load management software can schedule and throttle charging to avoid blowing local transformers. Time of use tariffs can shift demand to when the grid can handle it, and bidirectional charging could eventually turn millions of parked EVs into a distributed storage network. But none of these are simple. Together, all of these demand coordination across land policy, electricity regulation, highway planning, and federal politics. India's EV transition is one of the hardest stress tests on whether we have the political and institutional capacity to pull it off before the vehicles outrun the infrastructure they need. If you prefer reading the daily brief instead of watching the video, check out the link to the newsletter in the description. Coming to the second story. If you were looking for your first smartphone a decade ago, there's a good chance you went for Micromax. For a brief stretch around 2014-15, the Gurgaon based company was India's highest selling phone brand. Sadly, their reign wouldn't last for long. A wave of cheaper, slicker Chinese phones like Xiaomi, Vivo, Oppo soon washed over the market, more or less sweeping Micromax out of the picture. And that began Micromax's long years in the wilderness. It pulled back from the smartphone race, pivoting wildly for a foothold to sustain the company. It tried its hand at software and services, it widened its range to other electronics, it dropped down to making entry level feature phones. And years passed before it finally found a second lease on life, this time as a contract manufacturer for the very same Chinese companies that had once dethroned it. But the company still isn't short on ambition. It's now trying to break into one of the hardest, most tightly guarded businesses in all of technology, computer memory. So in late 2024, it entered a joint venture with Taiwan's Phison Electronics, MiFi Semiconductors, taking majority control of this new enterprise. And now the JV has become India's first company to design and build enterprise-grade solid-state drivers or SSDs. Like its first foray into smartphones all those years ago, this too is a daring attempt. As the world races to build new data centers, memory is turning into a bottleneck. So, if Micromax manages a foothold in this business, there are strong tailwinds ahead. But can it actually make a dent? So, an SSD is a device meant to store data. The version you're probably most familiar with sits inside your laptop as a faster, more durable version of those old spinning hard disks. But the same technology scales up all the way to enterprise grade devices, which sit in data centers running non stop to process its heavy load. Until recently, India imported all the SSDs that sat in its data centers. But now, the Fallen Phone brand is making a bid to manufacture these locally. Now, you can think of an SSD as having two parts. So, your data is physically stored in chips called NAND flash memory. These are a little like giant warehouses full of empty filing cabinets. They contain billions of tiny microscopic cells which can store electrons, and whether a cell is full or empty tells you whether it's a 0 or a 1 in binary terms. Only these chips are dumb. They can store things but nothing else. They can't read the data they store or make decisions on where to put a new file or how to find an old one. For that, you need a separate chip to act as its brain called the controller. And this chip has a more complex job. Within fractions of a second, it decides where any piece of data goes and how to fetch it back. Moreover, NAND flash memory keeps degrading as electrons are pulled in and out of its little cells, so the controller shuffles files around and runs constant error checks to catch and fix glitches. And if the power supply is suddenly cut, it uses a tiny built in energy reserve to save whatever you were working on before everything goes dark. Without this little chip, any storage would slow down, corrupt data, and burn out. Now, this is a harder chip to make, which is why Micromax has pulled Phison into the loop. So, Phison is one of the world's best companies at making controllers. The $3 billion company comes with over 24 years of experience and more than 2,000 patents to its name. And by its own count, 1 in every 5 SSDs shipped anywhere on the planet uses a Phison controller. Now, the Micromax Phison joint venture, or MiFi, is looking at a specific and very interesting niche of the SSD market. And the drives they're making solve a particular challenge that AI models face. So, any model works through a lot of data. But more critically, that data must be fed into its processing core continuously. And you can't keep all that data in a separate memory drive which sits elsewhere. That would be too slow and too far away for the speed at which the model actually needs the data. Now, at the moment, all that data is fit inside a GPU's built in memory called its VRAM, or Video Random Access Memory. This is fast, but it's also fixed in size and extremely expensive. So it's built into the GPU itself, and you can't expand it or top it up the way you can just slot an extra RAM into a PC. Now, for a big AI model, and modern ones are enormous, the usual fix is brute force. You buy a rack of graphics cards and chain them together, mainly to pool their combined memory rather than for the extra computing power. So, at any one moment, there might only be one GPU doing the math for one small slice of the model, while the rest sit there waiting their turn. This is wasteful, and it makes serious AI too expensive for a smaller company, lab, or university. But Phison is trying to fix this with a new design it calls AI Adaptive Plus. So instead of forcing a whole model into that scarce, costly memory, AI Adaptive Plus keeps only the active slice on the GPU while parking the rest on a big, cheap SSD. And as the card becomes ready for new data, it keeps passing slices up one at a time. And because an SSD costs a sliver of what a graphics card does, this brings costs down enormously. Now, the old paradigm is a little like looking in an industrial kitchen. Not because you need all its stoves, but because you need all the counter space to lay out your ingredients. Phison's chip lets you swap that for a regular kitchen with a big, well-stocked pantry. Naturally, this comes with trade-offs. For one, even with this new design, fetching data from an SSD is slower than keeping it all on the card. But for someone that would find a rack of GPUs too expensive to run, this might seem like a fair trade. Moreover, as the chip continuously shuttles slices of data from the SSD to a processor, it keeps writing and wiping that memory relentlessly. All that activity would burn a regular NAND flash memory within weeks. So this chip uses a much tougher kind of flash called pseudo SLC, or single level cell. Where regular memory can only be completely filled and wiped once a day, this can go through 100 such cycles a day, every day for 5 years. So, this is what MiFi is starting to build in India. The heavy duty AI drives that plug into that system for local buyers who want to run or fine tune big models on their own machines instead of renting cloud servers, which also keep sensitive data in house. But why is Micromax attempting this newest pivot? So, memory is the industry of the movement. India is in the middle of an AI and data center boom, and all those data centers need lots of storage. Phison has been looking for a way into this booming market, but there's a huge disadvantage it comes with. It's a foreign company with no manufacturing presence. So, an Indian manufacturer would have natural advantages in this space. A significant slice of the new demand is expected to come from government linked buyers, like public sector banks, state agencies, defense systems, the kind of customer that increasingly could want hardware made in India by an Indian controlled company. Phison wouldn't automatically be shut out of this market, but as a Taiwanese firm selling imported drives, its positioning isn't ideal. Its best case would be an Indian partner that was already manufacturing on Indian soil and was Indian owned enough for the finished drives to count as homegrown. Through its manufacturing arm Bhagwati Products, it already ran surface mount technology lines that placed chips into circuit boards. So the joint venture simply made sense. Phison gets a market while Micromax ideally gets the tech transfer. Micromax owns 55% and Taiwan's Phison Electronics owns 45%. For now, MiFi is making around 30,000 enterprise units a month and says it wants to hit 3 lakh, a tenfold jump within the year, chasing roughly rupees 1,000 crore in revenue and planning another rupees 1,000 crore of investment on top. Now, no joint venture comes without risks, and this one has quite a few. The first major risk is one we've covered extensively before. The entire memory business, be it consumer or enterprise, is not a place for beginners. At any given time, it has always been an oligopoly of just 3 to 4 companies holding immense market share. Today, that's Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. But that's not because of a lack of trying. And the reason is because the market is wildly cyclical. When demand is hot, memory makers earn enormous margins. When demand cools or the world simply makes too much, prices crash almost overnight and companies book losses running into billions. To survive that roller coaster, you need very deep pockets. And most newcomers just run out of money on the way down. So when the world overproduces and prices crash, giants like Samsung and Micron can sit on billions in cash and ride out a price war until things recover. A small young venture doesn't have that cushion, and a bad downturn at the wrong moment could be fatal. Now, the second major risk is dependence. The circuit boards are assembled and programmed in India, but the two things that matter most, the controller silicon and the raw NAND wafers, are still fully imported because nobody in India makes them yet. The controllers come out of Taiwan, so any flare up around the Taiwan Strait could freeze that supply overnight. And the NAND itself leans on Korean, Japanese, and US giants. Either way, if those imports stop, the Indian assembly lines stop with them. And then there's the trust problem. Convincing a cautious bank or a data center manager or someone who manages a hospital database to hand their most critical data to a brand famous for cheap phones is a long uphill climb. It takes years of flawless performance to build that reputation, and a single high profile failure could undo it and set the brand back by years. So, in the end, this is a test more than a comeback for Micromax. And India has primarily been good at two things: writing software for the world and lately assembling other people's gadgets. But moving from putting together finished products to designing and building complex, failure sensitive hardware like enterprise storage is a completely different league of engineering. Whether MiFi can actually win the trust of conservative corporate customers is still a far fetched question to answer. But the attempt is a sign that India has serious ambitions to move up the ladder. Now, coming to the tidbits. Tata Motors wants its car business along with JLR to hit around rupees 8.8 lakh crore in revenue by FY31 and is putting in rupees 40,000 crore in India plus roughly rupees 2.3 lakh crore at JLR to get there. The push is around new launches, EVs, and doubling India sales to 12 lakh units a year. Coming to the next tidbit. Ola Electric is being dragged to NCLT by two part suppliers, Sterling E-Mobility and Anavod Mando, over rupees 40 crore of unpaid dues. Ola says it's a quality dispute they'd already taken to arbitration, and the insolvency route is just the suppliers trying to force payment. Coming to the final tidbit. Sun Pharma's roughly rupees 1 lakh crore buyout of US drug maker Organon just got its financing locked in, with SBI joining 10 global banks like Citi, JP Morgan, HSBC, and MUFG, each chipping in around rupees 8,800 crore. It's also one of the first big overseas acquisition deals an Indian public sector bank is funding after the RBI opened this up in Feb. That's all the news I have for you. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next one. Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.